I was driving through Nevada on a cross-country trip when I decided to stop for the night. It was getting late, and the only place nearby was a rundown motel by the highway. It didn't look like much, but I was too tired to keep driving. I parked my car and went inside to check in. The lobby was empty except for the owner, an older man with a greasy smile. He handed me the key to my room, and I made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The place gave me the creeps, but I figured it was just my imagination running wild. My room was small and musty, but it had a bed and a shower, which was all I needed. I tossed my bag on the floor and lay down, hoping to get some rest. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises, whispers, footsteps, and the occasional bang from somewhere in the motel. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just other guests. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but I woke up a few hours later, needing to use the bathroom. As I stumbled out of bed, I heard voices outside my window. Curious, I peeked through the curtains. I saw the owner talking to a couple of men by the back of the motel. They were speaking in hushed tones, but I could make out bits and pieces of their conversation. They were talking about moving the curls and making sure no one saw anything. My heart started pounding as I realized what they were discussing. I stepped away from the window, my mind racing. It sounded like they were involved in something illegal, human trafficking. I felt sick to my stomach. I knew I had to get out of there, but I didn't want to raise any suspicion. I quietly gathered my things and slipped out of my room, heading for the lobby. The hallway was eerily silent, and I moved as quickly and quietly as I could. When I reached the lobby, I found it empty again. I crept towards the front door, but just as I was about to open it, I heard a voice behind me. "Where do you think you're going?" It was the owner. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a menacing glare. I stammered an excuse about needing to leave early, but he didn't buy it. He grabbed my arm and pulled me back towards the lobby. "You heard something you shouldn't have," he said, his grip tightening. Panic set in as I realized I was in serious danger. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. He dragged me towards a back room, and I knew I had to do something fast. Summoning all my strength, I shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, giving me just enough time to bolt for the door. I ran out into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached my car. Fumbling with the keys, I managed to unlock the door and jump inside. I started the engine and sped away from the motel, glancing in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following me. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. I drove for miles, not daring to stop until I reached a larger town where I felt safer. I found a diner and parked my car, shaking as I went inside. I called the police and told them everything I had heard and seen. They took my report seriously and said they would investigate the motel. I sat in the diner for hours, too scared to leave, replaying the night's events in my mind. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They had raided the motel and found evidence of human trafficking. The owner and several others were arrested. I was relieved but still shaken by the whole experience. I had been working the night shift at the old motel in Florida for about 6 months. It was a rundown place, not much traffic, mostly the same regulars and the occasional traveler who got lost or had car trouble. The pay was lousy, but it was a job, and I needed the money. One of our regulars was a guy named Carl. He'd come in every couple of weeks, always late at night, always paid in cash. He was quiet, kept to himself, never caused any trouble. But there was something about him that always felt off. Maybe it was the way he looked around, like he was expecting something to jump out at him. or the way he never stayed more than one night, always checking out early in the morning. One night, around 2 a.m., Carl came in. I could tell right away something was different. He was sweating, his eyes darting around more than usual. He barely looked at me as he handed over the cash for his room. His hands were shaking. I tried to make small talk, but he just mumbled something and headed straight to his room. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I watched the security cameras, keeping an eye on his room. About an hour later, I saw him come out and start pacing in front of his door. He looked agitated, kept glancing over his shoulder. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. I grabbed a stack of towels as an excuse and headed toward his room. As I got closer, I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I knocked on the door and called out, "Housekeeping." He opened the door just a crack, and I could see his eyes were wide with fear. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I just brought some fresh towels," I said, holding them up. "Are you okay, sir?" He stared at me for a long moment before nodding and taking the towels. "Thanks," he muttered before shutting the door in my face. I went back to the front desk, more uneasy than ever. I decided to look him up online. I had never bothered before, but something about tonight made me feel like I needed to know more. I typed in his name and the area into the search engine and started reading through the results. My blood ran cold when I saw a news article from a few years back. The photo was unmistakable. It was Carl. Only his name wasn't Carl. It was Daniel Markson, and he was wanted for multiple murders across several states. The article described him as extremely dangerous and likely armed. I felt a wave of panic but tried to keep calm. I was alone at the motel. There was no one to help me if things went south. I considered calling the police right then and there, but I worried about what would happen if Daniel realized I had made the call. I decided to wait and watch, hoping he would leave soon. But as the hours dragged on, he didn't come out of his room. I couldn't stop thinking about the article, the faces of his victims. I knew I had to do something. Finally, I called the police, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. They told me to stay calm and that they would send someone over right away. The wait felt like an eternity. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitor, praying he wouldn't come out and see me on the phone. When the police arrived, they moved in quietly. I pointed them to his room, and they knocked on the door, identifying themselves. For a moment, there was silence. Then, all hell broke loose. I heard shouting, a struggle, and then a gunshot. I ducked behind the counter, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear more shouting, but it was muffled. After what felt like forever, things went quiet. I peeked over the counter to see the police leading Daniel out in handcuffs. He looked defeated, his eyes on the ground. One of the officers came over to me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He explained that Daniel had tried to fight them off and had been shot in the leg, but he would be fine. More importantly, he was going back to face justice for his crimes. The police took my statement and left, and I was alone again in the quiet motel. The adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving me exhausted. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep, but I was grateful to be alive. In the following days, the motel was buzzing with activity. Reporters came by, and I had to give my statement over and over again. They praised me for my quick thinking, but I didn't feel like a hero. I was just glad it was over. I still worked the night shift at the motel, but I'm much more cautious now. I watch the guests more closely, trust my instincts more. I found myself driving along the winding coastal roads of Oregon, seeking a quiet retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. The motel I stumbled upon seemed perfect, an unassuming building nestled between the towering pines and overlooking the rugged coastline. The owner, Mr. Johnson, greeted me warmly as I checked in, his smile friendly yet slightly unnerving. The room was quaint and cozy, adorned with nautical decor that matched the seaside charm. I unpacked my bags and settled in, enjoying the peaceful sound of waves crashing against the shore. Mr. Johnson was attentive, offering suggestions for local sites to explore and even bringing me a complimentary bottle of wine that evening. But as the days passed, I started noticing peculiarities. Mr. Johnson would linger a little too long during our conversations, asking personal questions that made me uneasy. He seemed overly interested in my plans and whereabouts, almost as if he was keeping track of my every move. One afternoon, while exploring the motel grounds, I stumbled upon a shed at the back of the property. It was locked, but through a gap in the boards, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a collection of photographs and small objects. Curiosity piqued, I made a mental note to investigate further. That night, unable to shake off my unease, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until Mr. Johnson retired to his living quarters and then quietly made my way to the shed. With a bit of effort, I managed to pry open the lock and step inside. What I found sent chills down my spine. The shed was filled with photographs, faces of guests I had seen around the motel, including mine. Each photograph was accompanied by a small item, a hairbrush, a piece of jewelry, even a worn-out shoe. It dawned on me that these were Mr. Johnson's trophies, mementos he had collected from his guests. Fear gripped me as I realized the extent of his obsession. I hastily snapped a few pictures with my phone as evidence, my hands trembling with disbelief. Just as I was about to leave, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me as I realized Mr. Johnson must have discovered my intrusion. I barely had time to hide behind a stack of crates when he entered the shed, a flashlight in hand. His expression was cold and calculating, a stark contrast to the friendly demeanor he had shown me earlier. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the open lock, and then began muttering to himself. Heart pounding, I held my breath, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for him to leave. Finally, he turned and walked out, locking the shed behind him. I waited a few more agonizing moments before daring to move. I made my way back to my room in a daze, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I knew I had to leave immediately, but I couldn't risk confronting Mr. Johnson again. I hastily packed my belongings, leaving behind anything that might slow me down. As I reached the parking lot, I noticed Mr. Johnson standing near the reception area, his gaze fixed on the shed. I knew he must have suspected someone had been there. With my heart in my throat, I quietly slipped into my car and started the engine, praying he wouldn't notice me. I drove away as quickly as I could, my eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The coastal scenery that had seemed so serene only days before now felt ominous and threatening. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I booked a room in a busy hotel, surrounded by other guests and far away from Mr. Johnson's motel. I reported the incident to the local authorities, showing them the photographs I had taken as proof. They assured me they would investigate, but warned that without concrete evidence of criminal activity, their hands were tied. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Johnson had been watching me, even from afar. In the days that followed, I couldn't sleep properly, haunted by the realization of how close I had come to becoming one of Mr. Johnson's trophies. I kept imagining what might have happened if he had caught me in the shed. The thought sent shivers down my spine. Months passed, and eventually, I learned from a news report that Mr. Johnson had been arrested on unrelated charges. They found evidence linking him to a string of burglaries in the area, but there was no mention of his disturbing collection of trophies. I tried to put the ordeal behind me, but the memory of that coastal Oregon motel and its sinister owner still lingers. I took the job at the remote Colorado motel because it seemed peaceful and away from the city. The place was old but well kept, run by an older man named Mr. Thompson. He was a quiet guy, not very talkative. The motel had this eerie silence about it, especially at night when the wind howled through the pine trees surrounding it. My job was simple, checking in guests, cleaning rooms, and making sure everything ran smoothly. Most of the time, there weren't many guests. It felt like the world had forgotten about this place. But the pay was decent, and the solitude didn't bother me. One night, I was doing my rounds, checking that all the doors were locked. I passed by the office, where Mr. Thompson usually worked late. The door was slightly open, and I heard voices inside. Curious, I peeked through the gap. Mr. Thompson was talking to two men in suits. They looked out of place in this rundown motel. Their conversation was low, but I caught words like shipment and money. It didn't sit right with me. As I was about to walk away, the floorboard creaked. The men stopped talking. I quickly moved down the hall and into the laundry room, my heart pounding. I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. Over the next few days, I noticed strange things. Unmarked vans would arrive late at night. Mr. Thompson was more secretive, often locking himself in the office for hours. One evening, after all the guests had checked out, I decided to take a closer look. I waited until Mr. Thompson left for his usual late-night drive. I went to the office and tried the door. Locked. I remembered a spare key in the supply closet and fetched it. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The office was cluttered with papers and old furniture. I looked around, searching for anything unusual. Then I noticed a small door behind a bookshelf. It was almost hidden. I pushed the bookshelf aside and opened the door. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down to a basement. The air was musty and cold. I descended the stairs slowly, the steps creaking under my weight. At the bottom was another door, this one reinforced with metal. I pushed it open and froze. The room was filled with boxes and crates, all marked with symbols I didn't recognize. There were tables covered in documents, maps, and photographs. It looked like a scene from a crime movie. As I moved further in, I saw a large safe against the wall. I didn't have much time. I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside Mr. Thompson's car. Panic set in. I quickly looked through the papers on the table, trying to find anything that could explain what was going on. Drugs, weapons, money laundering, it was all here. I heard the office door open upstairs. My heart raced as I tried to find a place to hide. There was a small closet in the corner of the room. I squeezed inside and pulled the door shut just as I heard footsteps on the stairs. Mr. Thompson entered the room, followed by the two men in suits. They were discussing a new shipment. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. My mind raced with thoughts of what they would do if they caught me. They stayed in the room for what felt like hours, checking the contents of the crates and going over their plans. I couldn't make out everything, but it was clear they were involved in something big and dangerous. Finally, they started to leave. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I dared to move. I slipped out of the closet and back up the stairs, quietly closing the door behind me. I put the bookshelf back in place and locked the office door. My hands were still shaking. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly, but carefully. I had to get out without arousing suspicion. I left a note saying I had a family emergency and had to leave suddenly. Then I got in my car and drove away, my heart still pounding. As I drove through the dark, winding roads, I couldn't shake the fear that they might come after me. I had stumbled onto something dangerous, and I knew too much. I kept driving until I reached the next town, where I found a small, cheap motel and checked in. The next day, I went to the police. I told them everything I had seen and heard. They took my statement seriously and promised to investigate. I gave them the location of the hidden room and the evidence I had seen. A few weeks later, I heard that Mr. Thompson had been arrested, along with several others involved in the operation. The motel was shut down and searched thoroughly. The police found more than I had seen: weapons, drugs, money, all part of a large criminal network. I never went back to that motel. The experience left me shaken, but I was grateful to have gotten out alive. I checked into the motel late, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a small, rundown place in rural Kentucky, the kind you pass by without a second thought. I was traveling through for work, needing a place to sleep before heading out early the next morning. The manager, a burly man with a thick southern accent, handed me the key to room 6. He didn't say much, just nodded and went back to watching his TV. The room was as expected, old, musty, with a bed that creaked in a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I tossed my bag on the bed and decided to take a quick shower before getting some sleep. The water was lukewarm at best, and the pressure was almost non-existent. I didn't care. I just wanted to wash off the day's crime and relax. After my shower, I settled into bed with a book. It was quiet, almost too quiet, save for the occasional car passing by on the highway. I was starting to drift off when I heard a knock at the door. I looked at the clock, 11:30 p.m. Odd, I thought. Maybe it was the manager needing something. I got up, wrapped a towel around myself, and peeked through the peephole. There were 3 men standing outside, looking impatient. They didn't look like motel staff. I hesitated, unsure whether to open the door. Then one of them spoke up, his voice gruff. "We know you're in there. Open up, we need to talk." I cracked the door open just enough to see them clearly. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're the one who checked in today, right?" the same man asked. "Yes, why?" "Come on out, we need to have a chat," he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. "I don't think that's necessary. I'm just here for the night and leaving early tomorrow." The man exchanged a look with his companions. "Step outside." "Now," he ordered. I closed the door slightly, trying to think. They didn't look like they were going to leave. I didn't have many options. Grabbing my phone, I texted my colleague in trouble. "Room 6, Rural Motel. Call 911. Then I slowly opened the door again, stepping outside. The men surrounded me, their expressions hard. "We need to know who you're working for," the leader demanded. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, my voice shaking. "I'm just a traveler passing through. Don't lie to us. We know you're involved." "Who sent you?" he barked. Panic surged through me. They thought I was someone else, someone involved in whatever illegal activity they were part of. "I swear, you've got the wrong person. I'm not involved in anything. I don't know who you think I am, but I'm not them." The leader grabbed my arm, squeezing hard. "We don't believe you. You're coming with us." I struggled, trying to pull away. "Let go of me." I yelled, but it was no use. They were too strong. They dragged me towards a van parked nearby. My heart pounded as I fought to break free, but they shoved me inside and slammed the door shut. The drive felt like an eternity. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do to me. I had to find a way out. The van eventually stopped, and they pulled me out, leading me into an old, abandoned barn. Inside, there were more men, all armed. "Who the hell is this?" one of them asked. "She's the one from the motel." "Claim she's not involved," the leader said, pushing me forward. The new man studied me, his eyes cold and calculating. "Maybe she's telling the truth. We can't be sure." "Then what do we do with her?" the leader asked. "Keep her here until we figure it out," he replied. They tied me to a chair, the ropes cutting into my wrists. I sat there, my mind racing, trying to think of a way to escape. Hours passed, and the men argued amongst themselves. I caught snippets of their conversation. They were part of a local criminal ring, and they thought I was a spy or informant. As dawn approached, the men started to get agitated. They hadn't gotten any information out of me because I had nothing to give. The leader finally decided to call someone higher up. While they were distracted, I noticed a sharp piece of metal on the ground near my chair. I carefully worked the ropes against it, trying to cut through. It took time, but eventually, I managed to free my hands. I waited for the right moment when they were all focused on the phone call, and slipped out of the chair and bolted for the door. They shouted, realizing I was escaping, but I didn't look back. I ran into the woods, branches scratching my face and arms as I pushed through. I kept running, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get as far away as possible. Eventually, I stumbled upon a road and flagged down a passing car. The driver, a kind older woman, took one look at me and knew something was wrong. She drove me to the nearest police station. At the station, I told them everything. They took my statement and promised to investigate. My colleague had indeed called the police, and they were already looking for me. The criminals were arrested later that day, and I was finally safe. The experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how close I had come to being caught in something terrible, all because of a case of mistaken identity. I checked into the motel just outside of Bismarck, North Dakota, late in the evening. It was a long drive, and I needed a place to rest. The motel looked ordinary enough, nothing fancy, but it would do for the night. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, gave me a room key and a forced smile. Room 12. I thanked her and dragged my suitcase down the dimly lit hallway. The room was basic: bed, TV, small bathroom. I unpacked a bit and decided to grab something to eat from a nearby diner. When I returned, it was dark, and the motel seemed eerily quiet. I shrugged it off, thinking everyone was probably asleep. That night, I slept fitfully. Around 2 a.m., I heard faint noises, like muffled voices and a thump. I got up, peeking through the blinds. The parking lot was empty except for my car and one other. I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Telling myself it was just my imagination, I went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed the room next to mine, room 11, had its door open. A middle-aged man was packing his things into his car. I nodded at him, but he didn't seem to notice. At breakfast, I overheard the receptionist talking to a cleaning lady. "Another one gone," she whispered. The cleaning lady just nodded, looking unconcerned. I felt a chill but brushed it off. People checked out all the time, right? That night, I was more aware of the noises. Around the same time, 2 a.m., I heard the same muffled sounds. I debated whether to investigate but decided against it. I had an early start the next day and didn't want to get involved in someone else's business. The following morning, I noticed the door to room 10 was wide open. The guests who had been there the day before, a young couple, were gone. No luggage, no trace of them. The cleaning lady was already there, stripping the bed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked her, did the couple leave already? She glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Yes, early this morning, she mumbled. I went about my day, but a feeling of unease grew inside me. That evening, I decided to stay up and see what was going on. I kept my lights off and the blinds slightly open, watching the parking lot. Around midnight, a car pulled in. A man stepped out, checked into room 9. He looked normal, like any other traveler. At 2 a.m., the noises started again. This time, I was ready. I slipped out of my room and crept down the hallway. As I approached room 9, the noises grew louder. It sounded like a struggle. I hesitated, then knocked lightly. The noises stopped abruptly. I pressed my ear to the door but heard nothing. I hurried back to my room, heart pounding. The next morning, room 9 was open. The man was gone, just like the others. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong here. I went to the receptionist and asked directly, what's going on here? People are disappearing every night. She looked at me, her face pale. You need to leave, she said in a low voice. Get out of here while you can. What? Why? I demanded, but she turned away, refusing to say more. I packed my things quickly, my mind racing. As I loaded my car, I saw a group of men standing near the office, watching me. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, nodded in my direction. I got in my car and drove off, my hands shaking. As I sped away from the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped at a gas station a few miles down the road and called the police, telling them everything. They took my report but seemed skeptical. A few days later, I checked the news, but there was no mention of a motel or missing guests. It was like nothing had happened. I couldn't believe it. How could something so sinister be swept under the rug? The experience haunted me. I avoided motels after that, preferring to stay in well-known hotels. I still think about the people who vanished and wonder if the police ever looked into it. Sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m., heart pounding, half expecting to hear those muffled noises again. I was driving through New Mexico on my way to visit family, and it was getting late. I decided to stop at a small motel off the highway. It looked old, but I was tired and needed a place to rest. The sign said vacancy in flickering neon. I pulled into the gravel parking lot and walked to the office. The receptionist was an older woman, her face lined with age, but she had a friendly smile. She handed me the key to room 8 and told me to have a good night. I thanked her and went to my room. It was small but clean. I put my bag on the bed and decided to take a shower. As I was drying off, I noticed a pamphlet on the nightstand. It was about the history of the motel. Apparently, it had been there since the 1950s and had seen better days. There were photos of happy families and travelers from years past. I skimmed through it and noticed a small section about local legends. It mentioned that some guests had disappeared over the years, but it was written off as folklore. I went to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the pamphlet gave me. Around midnight, I heard a faint noise outside my door. It sounded like footsteps. I got up and peered through the peephole but saw nothing. I figured it was just another guest and went back to bed. The next morning, I went to the office to check out. The older woman was there, but she seemed different, more distant. I asked her about the pamphlet and the stories of people disappearing. She looked at me with a blank expression and said, "Those are just old tales. Don't worry about it." As I left, I saw a maintenance worker near the parking lot. He looked like he had been working there for years. I decided to ask him about the motel's history. He glanced around nervously before speaking in a low voice. People have gone missing here, but no one talks about it. Management wants to keep it quiet. They say it's bad for business. My heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What happened to them? He shook his head. No one knows for sure. They just vanish. Best to keep to yourself and not ask too many questions. I thanked him and got into my car. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. That night, I stayed at a different motel in a nearby town. I tried to put it out of my mind, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some research. I went to the local library and searched for information about the motel. I found old newspaper articles about people going missing. The articles were vague, but there were enough of them to make me worry. One article mentioned a young couple who vanished after staying there. Another talked about a traveling salesman who was never seen again. I couldn't believe it. How could something like this go unnoticed? I went back to the motel the next day, pretending I had left something behind. The older woman was still at the desk. I asked if she had seen my missing item, and she let me check my old room. As I searched the room, I noticed a small door in the closet that I hadn't seen before. It was partially hidden behind a stack of old blankets. I opened it and found a narrow staircase leading down to a dark basement. My heart raced as I descended the stairs. The basement was damp and musty. I saw old furniture and boxes covered in dust. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were personal items, wallets, bags, and clothes strewn across the floor. I recognized some of them from the photos in the pamphlet. I turned to leave, but heard footsteps above me. Panic set in. I hid behind a stack of boxes and waited. The older woman and a man I hadn't seen before came down the stairs. They were talking in hushed voices. "We need to move these soon," the man said. "Someone's going to notice." The woman nodded. "I know, but it's getting harder. People are asking questions." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were involved in the disappearances. I had to get out of there before they found me. I waited until they left and then made my way back up the stairs as quietly as possible. I slipped out of the room and ran to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped away. I drove straight to the nearest police station and told them everything. At first, they seemed skeptical, but when I showed them the articles and described what I had seen, they agreed to investigate. A few days later, I got a call from the police. They had found the basement and the evidence I described. The motel owners were arrested, and the motel was shut down. The story made the local news, and I was relieved that the truth had finally come out. But the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I avoided motels for a long time. Even now, I still think about the people who disappeared and wonder what really happened to them. It's something that will stay with me forever. I was driving through Wyoming on a road trip, just trying to clear my head. It was getting late, and I was too tired to keep going, so I decided to stop at a small motel just off the highway. The neon sign said vacancy. It looked a bit run down, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to sleep. I walked into the office, and there was a man behind the desk. He looked tired, with bags under his eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lips. He gave me a room key without much conversation. Room 12. I thanked him and walked to my room. The hallways were dimly lit, and everything smelled faintly of mildew. The room was basic: a bed, a small TV, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I threw my bag on the bed and decided to take a quick shower. As the hot water hit my skin, I felt some of the tension from driving all day start to melt away. After my shower, I laid on the bed and flipped through the channels on the TV, trying to find something to watch. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was woken up by a loud banging on my door. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My heart started racing. Who would be knocking on my door at this hour? I got up and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out. "Police," a voice answered. "Open up." Confused and a little scared, I opened the door a crack. 2 men stood there, flashing their badges. They looked rough, like they had been up all night. "We need to talk to you," one of them said. "Can we come in?" I let them in, my mind racing with what they could want. "Is there a problem, officers?" One of them, a tall guy with a scar on his cheek, looked at me with cold eyes. "We got a report that someone fitting your description was seen near the scene of a crime earlier tonight. We need to ask you a few questions." I was taken aback. There must be some mistake. I've been here all night. I just checked in a few hours ago. The other cop, shorter and stockier, looked around my room as if he was expecting to find something. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a question. I nodded, feeling cornered. They started going through my things, rifling through my bag and checking the bathroom. I stood there, feeling helpless. After a few minutes, they seemed satisfied and turned back to me. "You're not in any trouble," the tall one said. "But we need you to come down to the station and answer a few questions, just to clear things up." I didn't want to go, but what choice did I have? "Okay," I said. "Let me grab my wallet." I reached for my wallet on the nightstand, but as I turned around, I caught a glimpse of the tall cop's face. He had a strange look in his eyes, something that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, the shorter one grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. The tall one pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, struggling against them. "Just a precaution," the tall cop said, but his tone was menacing. They cuffed me and dragged me out of the room, ignoring my protests. They shoved me into the back of their squad car and started driving. My mind was racing. This didn't feel right. They weren't taking me to the station. We were heading out of town, into the dark, empty stretches of road. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a little detour," the tall cop said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with that same cold look. The car finally stopped in a secluded area, far from any lights or buildings. They pulled me out and pushed me to the ground. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I was in serious trouble. "We can't let you go," the tall cop said. "You know too much." "But I don't know anything." I shouted. "You've got the wrong guy." They didn't listen. The shorter cop pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But then a miracle happened. I heard the sound of another car approaching. The cops looked at each other, panicked. "We have to go," the tall one said. They jumped into their car and sped off, leaving me cuffed and lying on the ground. The other car stopped, and a man got out. He was a truck driver who had seen the squad car and decided to check what was going on. He freed me from the cuffs and drove me to the nearest town, where I reported everything to the real police. It turned out those cops were part of a corrupt group involved in various illegal activities, and they thought I was a witness who could expose them. They were arrested and charged, but the whole experience left me shaken. I was on a road trip through Washington state, winding through the dense forests and misty mountains. The day was fading fast, and I needed a place to spend the night. Eventually, I came across a secluded motel nestled at the edge of a thick forest. The place had an eerie charm to it, with its flickering neon sign and weathered facade. I parked my car and walked into the lobby, where an elderly man greeted me with a toothless smile. His eyes darted nervously, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Ignoring my unease, I checked into a room on the ground floor, eager to rest after a long day of driving. The room was dimly lit, furnished with outdated decor that added to its unsettling atmosphere. As I unpacked, I noticed a slight draft near the corner of the room. Curiosity piqued, I investigated and found a small trapdoor hidden beneath a worn-out rug. My heart raced as I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. Hesitant but driven by morbid curiosity, I descended into the depths below. The air grew colder and mustier with each step, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnels. I found myself in a maze of interconnected passages, the walls lined with pipes and exposed wiring. As I ventured deeper, I stumbled upon a makeshift room filled with crates and boxes. They were labeled with strange symbols and markings, hinting at their illicit contents. My heart sank as I realized I had stumbled upon something far more sinister than I had ever imagined, a hideout used by a criminal gang. Fear gripped me as I heard voices echoing through the tunnels. I hid behind a stack of crates, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The voices drew nearer, accompanied by the sound of footsteps echoing off the damp walls. I dared not move, praying they wouldn't discover me. Through a small gap, I glimpsed two men clad in dark clothing, their faces obscured by shadows. They spoke in hushed tones about their next operation, a smuggling operation involving drugs and weapons. My mind raced as I realized the danger I was in, trapped deep underground with ruthless criminals. I waited until the coast was clear before making my way back to the trapdoor. Adrenaline surged through me as I climbed the stairs, my every sense on high alert. Back in my room, I barricaded the trapdoor with furniture, hoping to buy myself some time. Hours passed in agonizing silence, every creak and rustle making me jump. I knew I had to get out of there, but the motel was isolated, and I had no way of contacting the outside world. Desperation set in as I considered my options, weighing the risks of making a run for it against the certainty of staying trapped. As night fell, I heard commotion outside my door. Voices argued in harsh whispers, punctuated by the occasional thud and clatter. Fear paralyzed me as I realized they were searching the motel, likely looking for any signs of intrusion. I pressed myself against the wall, praying they wouldn't discover my hiding place. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on my door. My heart stopped as I heard the elderly motel owner's voice, asking if everything was all right. I remained silent, barely daring to breathe. The knocking grew louder, accompanied by demands to open the door. I knew I couldn't stay hidden forever. With trembling hands, I unlocked the door and came face to face with the motel owner and one of the men from the tunnels. Their expressions were cold and calculating, confirming my worst fears. They demanded to know what I had seen, their threats thinly veiled beneath a veneer of civility. Terrified but defiant, I lied, claiming ignorance and innocence. They exchanged a knowing glance before ordering me to pack my things. I complied, knowing I had no choice but to follow their orders if I wanted to survive. They escorted me to the parking lot, where my car stood as my only means of escape. I fumbled with my keys, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Just as I was about to climb into the driver's seat, I felt a firm hand on my shoulder. I turned to see the motel owner standing behind me, his eyes cold and menacing. He warned me never to speak of what I had seen, threatening dire consequences if I did. With no other option, I nodded in silent agreement. They watched as I drove away, leaving the motel and its hidden horrors behind me. Fear and relief washed over me in equal measure as I sped down the darkened road, the distant lights of civilization offering a glimmer of safety. I reported the incident to the authorities, providing them with as much information as I dared. They promised to investigate, but I knew the odds of finding evidence in those tunnels were slim. I spent sleepless nights haunted by the memory of that motel and the criminals who operated beneath it. Months passed, and life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. I avoided secluded motels and learned to trust my instincts more than ever. The encounter had left scars, reminders of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. To this day, I wonder what became of the criminal gang and the motel owner. I pray they never cross my path again. My friend Jake and I decided to take a road trip through Texas. We'd been planning it for months, wanting to see the rural parts of the state, far from the big cities. We packed up the car and hit the road, eager for the adventure. After a long day of driving, we needed a place to crash for the night. We found a small, run-down motel just up the highway. It looked a bit sketchy, but we were too tired to keep driving. The neon sign flickered as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The manager was an older guy, probably in his late 50s. He seemed friendly enough, a bit too friendly maybe. He gave us a room key and told us to let him know if we needed anything. The room was basic, just 2 beds, a TV, and a small bathroom. It smelled a bit musty, but we didn't care. We just wanted to sleep. After getting settled, Jake turned on the TV while I took a shower. When I came out, Jake was already half asleep, the TV playing some late-night infomercial. I lay down and tried to relax, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I shrugged it off and closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest. In the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like a faint buzzing. I sat up and looked around the dark room, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Jake was still asleep, snoring softly. The noise seemed to be coming from behind the TV. I got up and moved closer, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it, a tiny hole in the wall, right behind the TV. I leaned in closer, peering into the hole. It was too dark to see anything, but the buzzing noise was louder now. My heart started to race. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to get a better look. There was a small, black device in the hole, and it was definitely a camera. I felt a wave of panic wash over me. Why was there a camera in our room? I shook Jake awake, trying to stay calm. He groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on?" he mumbled. "There's a camera," I whispered, pointing to the hole behind the TV. His eyes widened as he grabbed his phone and looked for himself. "What the hell?" he muttered, now fully awake. We started searching the room, looking for more cameras. It didn't take long to find them. There was one in the air vent, another in the bathroom mirror, and one more in the smoke detector. Someone had been watching us the whole time. Jake wanted to confront the manager right away, but I convinced him we needed to be careful. If this guy was shady enough to put cameras in our room, who knows what else he was capable of? We decided to gather our stuff and get out of there as quickly and quietly as possible. We packed up in record time, checking for any more hidden cameras as we went. My hands were shaking as I zipped up my bag. We crept out of the room, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The motel was eerily silent, not a single sound except for our footsteps. As we reached the car, I glanced back at the motel office. The manager was there, watching us through the window. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. He knew we had found the cameras. We jumped into the car and sped off, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from that place. When we finally pulled over at a gas station, Jake called the police. They told us to come to the nearest station to file a report. At the station, we told the officers everything. They seemed to take it seriously, assuring us they would investigate. We gave them the address of the motel and all the details we could remember. As we left the station, I felt a bit of relief, but the fear was still there, gnawing at me. Over the next few days, we tried to put the incident behind us. But it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tiny, hidden cameras and the manager's cold stare. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. A week later, Jake called me with some news. He had done some digging online and found out that the motel manager had been arrested. The police had found a whole network of hidden cameras in the rooms, all connected to a live stream on the dark web. Dozens of people had been unknowingly filmed, their private moments broadcasted to who knows how many strangers. The news made me sick to my stomach. We had been lucky to get out of there unharmed, but the thought of what could have happened haunted me. I deleted my social media accounts and changed my phone number, paranoid that someone might still be watching. To this day, I can't stay in motels or hotels without thoroughly checking for cameras. I don't trust anyone who seems too friendly, and I always keep my guard up. It was supposed to be a simple stopover. I had been driving for hours along the California coast, heading south to visit my sister. The sun was setting, and I decided to find a place to stay for the night. I pulled into a small, nondescript motel off the highway. It looked a bit run down, but I was too tired to be picky. The manager at the front desk was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. She checked me in with minimal conversation and handed me a key. My room was at the far end of the building, away from the road noise. It seemed quiet enough, and I was grateful for that. After settling in, I decided to take a shower. The water pressure was weak, but the hot water felt good. I wrapped myself in a towel and looked out the window. The parking lot was almost empty, just a couple of cars scattered around. One of them, a black SUV, stood out. It was parked at an odd angle, and I couldn't see anyone in or around it. I shrugged it off and got dressed. My plan was to grab some food from the vending machine and call it a night. As I stepped out of my room, I heard voices coming from the room next to mine. The walls were thin, and the voices were loud and angry. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether I should knock on their door and ask them to keep it down, but decided against it. Walking towards the vending machine, I saw a man standing by the black SUV. He was on his phone, speaking in a low, urgent tone. His eyes darted around nervously. Something about him made me uneasy, so I kept my head down and moved quickly. As I reached the vending machine, I realized I had forgotten my wallet in the room. I turned back, annoyed with myself. As I passed the SUV again, the man was no longer there. The voices from the adjacent room had grown louder, and I could now make out a few words. They were arguing about money and something that sounded like shipment. Back in my room, I grabbed my wallet and paused. I heard a door slam and then a muffled thud. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but I could hear the sound of footsteps coming from the room next to mine. My heart pounded as I slowly opened my door and stepped out. I walked past the neighboring room, trying to be as quiet as possible. The door was slightly ajar, and I couldn't help but take a peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were two men in the room. One was on the floor, lying motionless in a pool of blood. The other man, the one I had seen by the SUV, was standing over him, holding a bloody knife. He looked up and our eyes met for a brief second. I quickly stepped back, hoping he hadn't recognized me, Panicked, I hurried back to my room and locked the door. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I knew I had to get out of there. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I could hear the man moving around in the next room, and I knew I didn't have much time. I grabbed my things and quietly opened the door. The hallway was still empty. I moved swiftly towards the exit, praying I wouldn't run into anyone. As I reached the parking lot, I saw the man again. He was loading something into the trunk of the SUV. I ducked behind a car and watched, my heart pounding in my chest. He finished what he was doing and got into the SUV. I waited until he drove off before making a run for my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, not caring about the speed limits. I drove for miles, not daring to stop until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. I parked in a well-lit area and sat there, trying to calm down. I knew I had to call the police, but I was terrified the man might find me. What if he had seen my license plate? What if he knew who I was? I finally mustered the courage to call 911. The dispatcher took my information and assured me that officers would be sent to the motel. They advised me to stay put and wait for the police to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as I waited in the gas station parking lot. Eventually, a patrol car pulled up, and 2 officers approached me. I explained everything I had seen, and they took my statement. They told me to stay in town for the night and check into a different motel. They would keep me updated on the situation. I barely slept that night, jumping at every sound. The next morning, I got a call from one of the officers. They had found the man's body in the motel room, but the suspect was still at large. They assured me they were doing everything they could to find him and keep me safe. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I moved in with my sister temporarily, too scared to stay alone. The police kept in touch, but there were no new leads. The suspect had vanished without a trace. It took a long time for me to feel somewhat safe again. I installed security cameras at my sister's place and never went anywhere without checking my surroundings. The fear never completely went away, but I learned to live with it. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of the dangers that could be lurking around every corner. I checked into the small-town Mississippi motel late at night, exhausted from my long drive. The neon sign flickered outside, casting an eerie glow over the rundown building. The manager, a quiet man with a greasy comb-over, handed me a key without much conversation. My room was at the end of a dimly lit hallway, far from the other guests. The room was musty, with peeling wallpaper and a bed that looked like it had seen better days. Too tired to care, I tossed my bag on a chair and collapsed onto the bed. As I lay there, I noticed a small notebook tucked between the nightstand and the bed. Curious, I picked it up and flipped through the pages. The notebook was filled with handwritten entries, some dated as far back as a decade. The first few pages seemed innocent enough, notes about repairs and supplies. But as I read further, the entries became more sinister. Descriptions of guests, their habits, and disturbing details about their stays filled the pages. One entry described a couple who had stayed in my very room, ending with the words, "They won't be leaving." My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just a maintenance log. The entries detailed crimes committed against the motel's guests. There were notes about burglaries, assaults, and even a few that hinted at disappearances. The more I read, the more I understood that the person who wrote this was still working here, still watching. I decided to pack up and leave immediately. I didn't care about getting my money back or finding another place to stay. As I shoved my things into my bag, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped right outside my door. I froze, holding my breath, and listened. A light knock on the door made me jump. "Is everything all right in there?" It was the manager's voice. I tried to sound calm as I replied, "Yes, everything's fine." The silence that followed was unnerving. I could feel his presence just outside the door, listening, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated down the hall. I finished packing as quickly and quietly as I could. I knew I had to get out of there without being seen. I opened the door a crack and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. I slipped out of the room and crept towards the exit. As I passed the front desk, I saw the manager watching something on a small TV. His back was to me, and I took the opportunity to slip past unnoticed. Once outside, I ran to my car and drove off without looking back. My hands were shaking as I sped down the empty highway. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror made my heart race. I drove for hours until I reached the next town and found a well-lit, busy motel. I called the local police and told them about the notebook. They took my report seriously and promised to investigate. I handed over the notebook, glad to be rid of it. The officer assured me they would look into the manager and the motel's history. Days passed, and I tried to put the experience behind me. But the fear lingered. I kept checking the news, hoping to hear that the manager had been arrested, but there was nothing. I wondered how many other guests had found that notebook and what had happened to them. Weeks later, I received a call from the police. They had arrested the manager. The notebook had been the key to linking him to several unsolved cases in the area. They found evidence in his office that confirmed he had been preying on guests for years. I felt a mix of relief and horror. Relief that he had been caught, but horror at how close I had come to being his next victim. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I never stayed in motels again, preferring the safety of well-reviewed hotels. The fear never completely went away, but I learned to live with it. I often thought about the other victims, those who hadn't been as lucky as me. Their stories haunted my dreams. The memory of that night in the small-town Mississippi motel would stay with me forever. The flickering neon sign, the musty room, the disturbing notebook, all reminders of how close I had come to being another entry in the manager's twisted journal. I checked into a cheap motel in Arizona after a long day of driving. The sun had set, casting long shadows over the dusty parking lot. The place looked run down, but I was too tired to care. The manager, an older man with a scruffy beard and yellow teeth, handed me the key to my room with a mumbled greeting. The room was at the far end of the building, away from the few other cars parked outside. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bedspread had seen better days. I set my bags down and flopped onto the bed, ready to relax. As I lay there, I heard a faint buzzing noise. I realized it was my phone, vibrating with a new message. I picked it up and saw an unknown number. "Nice red shirt. It suits you." I looked down at my shirt, a red t-shirt I had thrown on that morning. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't seen anyone since I checked in. I glanced around the room, looking for hidden cameras, but saw nothing. I tried to shrug it off as a prank, but it still bothered me. A little while later, I decided to take a shower. As I stood under the hot water, I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched. I quickly finished up and got dressed, then checked my phone again. Another message from the same number. "Hope you enjoyed your shower." My heart raced. Someone was definitely watching me. I went to the window and peered through the thin curtains, but the parking lot was empty except for the few cars. I double-checked the door to make sure it was locked, then sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing. Minutes turned into hours, and I tried to distract myself with TV, but every noise outside made me jump. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off, only to be woken by another message. Sweet dreams. I felt a surge of anger and fear. I needed to find out who was doing this. I grabbed my phone and texted back, demanding to know who they were and what they wanted. There was no reply. I paced the room, unable to calm down. The minutes dragged by, and then another message came through. Look outside. I hesitated, then slowly approached the window. I parted the curtains just enough to see out. A figure stood in the parking lot, shrouded in darkness. They were looking directly at my room. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away, my hands shaking. I called the front desk, but there was no answer. Panic set in as I realized how isolated I was. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That someone was sending me creepy messages? It seemed so unreal, like something out of a movie. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze, my heart pounding. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The same figure from the parking lot stood outside, face hidden in the shadows. I backed away, searching for something to defend myself with. My eyes landed on a heavy lamp on the nightstand. I picked it up, holding it like a weapon. The knocking continued, relentless and insistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I stood there, lamp in hand, listening intently. My phone buzzed again. You're fun to play with. I felt a surge of rage. I threw the phone across the room, and it hit the wall with a thud. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my bag and threw it over my shoulder, then cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, ready to run to my car, but something made me stop. A sound, faint and almost imperceptible, came from the direction of the front desk. I crept down the hall, lamp still in hand, and peeked around the corner. The manager was sitting at the desk, his back to me, typing something on a laptop. The screen cast an eerie glow on his face. I approached quietly, trying to see what he was doing. As I got closer, I saw a series of windows open on his screen, each showing a different angle of the motel. He had cameras everywhere. My room, the parking lot, the hallways, all of it under surveillance. My blood ran cold as I realized he was the one sending the messages. I wanted to confront him, to scream and demand answers, but fear held me back. I turned and ran back to my room, grabbing my phone and keys. I dashed out to my car, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the door open. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I sped out of the parking lot, I saw the manager standing at the entrance, watching me with a twisted smile on his face. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. I found a busy hotel, one with lots of people and bright lights. I checked in and locked myself in my room, feeling a sense of safety for the first time that night. I called the police and told them everything. They took my report and promised to investigate. I never heard back about what happened to that manager. I was vacationing in Georgia, staying at a small motel just off the highway. It wasn't anything special, but it was clean and cheap. I arrived late in the afternoon, tired from the long drive. The place was almost empty, just a few cars in the lot. I checked in, got my tea, and headed to my room. The room was simple, with a bed, a small TV, and a bathroom. I threw my bags on the bed and decided to take a walk to stretch my legs. The area around the motel was quiet, just a few trees and the distant hum of the highway. I felt a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off as just being tired. When I got back to my room, I noticed someone had checked into the room next door. The blinds were drawn, but I could hear muffled voices. I didn't think much of it and went about my evening, grabbing a quick dinner from a nearby diner. Back in my room, I settled in to watch some TV. The voices next door were louder now, but still muffled. It sounded like an argument. I turned up the volume to drown it out, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The arguing continued, rising and falling in intensity. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I turned off the TV and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices were clearer now. A man's voice, low and threatening, and a woman's voice, pleading. My stomach knotted as I realized this wasn't just a regular argument. I debated what to do. Calling the front desk seemed pointless. The motel manager didn't strike me as someone who'd get involved. I didn't want to call the police without more information, but I couldn't just ignore it either. The voices grew louder, the man's tone more aggressive. I decided to take a closer look. I slipped out of my room and walked down the hallway, trying to be as quiet as possible. I stood outside the door to the next room, straining to hear. The man was saying something about staying quiet and not causing trouble. The woman was crying, begging him to let her go. My heart pounded. This was serious. I pulled out my phone and started recording, needing some evidence if I was going to call the police. Suddenly, the door to the room opened. I froze, not knowing what to do. The man stepped out, glancing around before closing the door behind him. He didn't see me, but I got a good look at him. Tall, muscular, with a shaved head and a menacing look in his eyes. He walked down the hall, and I quickly ducked back into my room. I waited until I heard his footsteps fade away before I called the police. I explained what I had heard and seen, hoping they would take it seriously. They assured me they were sending someone right away. I stayed by the door, listening for any sign of the man's return. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The police arrived, and I stepped out to meet them, pointing them to the room next door. They knocked, identifying themselves. There was no answer at first, but then the door opened. The man tried to act calm, but the police weren't buying it. They pushed past him and found the woman inside, tied to a chair and clearly terrified. They quickly arrested the man and freed the woman. She was in shock, but otherwise okay. I gave my statement to the police, showing them the recording I had made. They thanked me for my help and assured me the man would be charged. The woman was taken to the hospital, and I was left standing there, shaken by what had just happened. The rest of my vacation was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman and what might have happened if I hadn't acted. I didn't get much sleep that night, jumping at every sound. By morning, I was ready to leave that motel behind. As I packed up my things, the motel manager knocked on my door. He apologized for what had happened and offered me a refund. I just wanted to get out of there. I thanked him and left as quickly as I could. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had stumbled into something terrible, but at least I had done something to help. The experience left me wary of places like that, reminding me that you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. I was on a long road trip through the Midwest, trying to get to a friend's wedding. The drive was taking longer than I expected, so I decided to stop for the night at a small, isolated motel I found just off the highway. It looked run down, but I was too tired to care. I checked in with a guy at the front desk who barely looked at me. He handed me a key and told me my room was around the back. The room was what you'd expect for the price. It was old, smelled a bit musty, and the bed creaked when I sat on it. I set my bag down, took a quick shower, and then collapsed onto the bed. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime in the middle of the night, I thought I heard something outside my door. It sounded like someone was trying to open it. I got up and looked through the peephole, but I couldn't see anything. I figured it was just my imagination or maybe the wind. I went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. When I woke up the next morning, I felt groggy. I got dressed and went outside to get to my car, but it wasn't where I had parked it. Panic set in. I ran around the lot, thinking maybe I had parked it somewhere else, but it was gone. I went back to my room, and that's when I noticed my bag was missing too. My wallet, my phone, everything was in there. I went to the front desk to report the theft. The same guy was there, but he acted like he didn't remember me checking in. He said he didn't see anything and that it was probably my fault for not locking my car. I knew I had locked it, though. The more I talked to him, the more hostile he became. He said there was nothing he could do and told me to leave. Without my car and my belongings, I was stranded. I went back to my room, trying to figure out what to do next. There was no one else around. It felt like I was the only guest at the motel. I decided to walk down the road to see if I could find help, but as I walked, I felt like I was being watched. I saw an old payphone near the edge of the property and tried to use it, but it was broken. When I turned around, I saw the guy from the front desk watching me from the doorway of the office. He had a strange look on his face, almost like he was enjoying my desperation. I went back to my room, feeling hopeless. I tried to think of a plan, but without my phone or any way to contact someone, I was stuck. I heard footsteps outside again and decided to see who it was. When I opened the door, I saw two men standing there, both of them looking rough and unfriendly. They told me they were there to help, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I backed away, trying to close the door, but one of them shoved it open and pushed me back into the room. They started going through my things, even though there wasn't much left to take. They found my car keys, which I had left on the nightstand, and one of them pocketed them with a grin. I tried to leave, but the other man blocked my way. They told me I wasn't going anywhere until I paid them for helping me. I had nothing to give them, and they knew it. They started arguing with each other, and I took the chance to slip past them and run out the door. I ran down the road, not looking back. I could hear them yelling, but I kept going. After what felt like hours, I saw a small diner up ahead. I burst through the doors, out of breath, and told the people inside what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of pity and disbelief, but called the police for me. When the police arrived, I told them everything. They went to the motel, but by the time they got there, the place was empty. The guy at the front desk and the two men were gone. They found my car hidden behind the motel, but everything inside it was gone. My belongings were never found. The police took me to the station where I could finally call my family. They helped me get back on my feet, but the whole experience left me shaken. I couldn't believe how quickly things had gone wrong and how vulnerable I had been. I still think about that night sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the hostility of the motel staff, and the terror of realizing I was stranded with no help in sight. It's made me more cautious, especially when traveling alone. I checked into the motel on a rainy afternoon. It was the only place for miles, a small building nestled among the trees on a quiet road in New England. I had been driving for hours and needed a place to rest. The woman at the front desk was polite but distant, giving me a key to a room at the far end of the hallway. The lobby was dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew, My room was basic but clean. I dropped my bags, took a quick shower, and settled in. I planned to leave early the next morning, so I set my alarm and crawled into bed. The rain outside was soothing, and I started to drift off to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up to muffled voices. It was coming from the room next door. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was an urgency in their tone that made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but the voices grew louder, and I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth. Curiosity got the better of me, and I got out of bed, pressing my ear to the wall. I could only catch fragments of the conversation, words like shipment, security, and timing. My heart started to race. It sounded like they were planning something big. The next morning, I went to the lobby to get some coffee. The same woman from yesterday was there, but now she was joined by a man who looked equally unfriendly. They both watched me closely as I poured my coffee. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I walked back to my room, I noticed a few other guests in the hallway. They were all men, dressed in dark clothes, and they all seemed to be watching me. I quickly went back to my room and locked the door. I needed to figure out what was going on. I spent the day in my room, trying to gather my thoughts. Around midday, I heard a knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat. I cautiously opened it, and a man I hadn't seen before was standing there. He asked if I needed anything, but his eyes were cold and calculating. I said no and quickly shut the door. By now, I was convinced that something illegal was happening. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to raise suspicion. I decided to wait until nightfall, hoping I could slip away unnoticed. As evening approached, I packed my bags and waited for the right moment. Around midnight, the voices next door started up again. It was my chance. I quietly opened my door and peered down the hallway. It was empty. I made my way to the lobby, but as I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see one of the men from the hallway approaching. Panic set in, and I bolted out the door, running to my car. I fumbled with my keys, finally getting the door open, and jumped in. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man standing in the doorway, watching me leave. My heart was pounding, but I kept driving, not daring to look back again. I drove for hours until I reached the next town. I found a diner and went inside, shaking and exhausted. I sat down and ordered a coffee, trying to calm my nerves. I overheard a conversation at the counter about a big heist that had been thwarted nearby. The pieces started to fall into place. The people at the motel were part of a crime syndicate, and I had stumbled into their midst. They had been planning a major heist, and I had been a potential witness. I realized how lucky I was to have gotten unscathed. I eventually made it to my destination, but the experience left a lasting mark. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I had been caught. It made me more cautious, especially when traveling alone. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those voices in my head, and I remember the cold, calculating eyes of a man at my door